From wireframe models wandering a maze to fully fledged characters and narratives, the first-person shooter, one of the most popular and defined genres within the video game industry, has seen a meteoric rise over the last 40 years. But where did it all begin? First-person shooters are a type of shooter game where the player sees the gameplay out through the point of view of a character they're playing, unlike its counterpart, third-person shooters, which allows the player to see the character they are controlling. As implied in the name, the primary element of first-person shooters is combat, through the use of firearms, melee weaponry, or whatever your character can get their hands on. First-person shooters often focus on action gameplay, with fast-paced and bloody firefights, though the progression of graphics and game engines in the 90s allowed game developers to place the character in a more defined game world, with a greater emphasis on narrative and problem solving. Although the term first-person shooter was not coined during these times, the earliest documented first-person shooters were two games, Maze War and Space Sim, which were both developed in the early 1970s. Maze War, developed by a group of high school students in 1973, was a maze game that placed the player within a maze in a first-person point of view. The game itself was presented in a single plane, 16 x 32 tile wireframe environment for only one player, but eventually support was added to the game that allowed a second player and the ability to defeat one another. Steve Coley, one of the creators, mentioned, "Maze was popular at first, but quickly became boring, then someone had the idea to put people in the maze. To do this would take more than one MLAC, which at the time were not networked together. So we connected two MLACs using the serial ports to transmit locations back and forth. This worked out great, and soon the idea for shooting each other came along, and the first-person shooter was born." Maze War became a cult classic, and its popularity soon spawned a variety of clones and relatable games, dubbed dungeon crawlers, which filled the 1970s with maze-running games. These dungeon crawlers were billed as rat's eye view experiences by the Computer and Video Games magazine in 1981, which could be said is the predecessor term to first-person shooters. Space Sim, developed by Jim Bowery in 1974, was a first-person space flight simulator that could host up to 32 players. The game placed the player in a 3D environment, with other players' ships appearing as wireframe models, and the aim was to destroy the other team's ships whilst protecting your own. Space Sim paved the way for more detailed combat simulators, with the US Army developing their own tank and flight simulators, though these weren't released to the public. However, in 1980, the first-person tank simulator Battlezone made its way to the arcades and soon home computers, becoming one of the first successful mass-market first-person shooters that featured wireframe 3D graphics on a vector display. Throughout the 70s and 80s, new rendering technologies advanced, such as raycasting, which made the computer only render what the player could see instead of the whole map, as well as texture mapping, which were pioneered through id Software's Hovertank 3D and Catacombs 3D, with Catacombs being the first game to introduce the protagonist's hand and weapon on screen. The advancement in these new graphical technologies allowed the first-person genre to slowly shift away from being vehicle simulators. The 1990s saw the meteoric rise of both video games and first-person shooters due to the advancements in game engines and graphics. Wolfenstein 3D, built on the raycasting technology pioneered by games within the late 80s, created the groundbreaking template for shooter game design, which is still utilised by first-person shooters to this day. Wolfenstein was one of the first shooters that allowed you to take control of a character and use a variety of weapons to dispatch your 2D foes, which was a breath of fresh air from the abundance of vehicle simulators released a few years beforehand. The The template set by Wolfenstein soon spawned a variety of spin-offs and heavily influenced games, and a year later came id's newest venture, Doom. Yet another commercial success for id Software, Doom is said to be severely influential for video games and multiplayer. Using a much more refined Wolfenstein 3D template, the game introduced new features to the engine, such as map elevation, improved textures and lighting effects, which gave the 3D environment a much more realistic feel compared to its predecessor. Multiplayer, which is featured in almost every modern video game, was first achieved successfully on a large scale with Doom. The game pitted players against each other competitively to fight on a variety of maps, with the game mode dubbed death matches, a word now commonly used in the video game language. Multiplayer within games was on the rise, thanks to the newly founded internet infrastructure, and the mid to late 90s saw a surge in multiplayer action. With computers now being able to render both 3D environments and inhabitants, developers were able to provide the player with a variety of new gameplay options, evident within yet another id Software title, Quake. Quake was id Software's first title to use real-time 3D rendering, and with Doom's multiplayer being a success, featured both a co-op and competitive mode. However, Quake's success was met with some competition. Unreal, by Epic Games, had a number of new features and was built on its own unique game engine, different to the templates used by id Software. In 1999, Epic released Unreal Tournament, which was one of the first purely multiplayer-focused first-person shooters, and this was rivaled by id Software's Quake 3 Arena. Towards the back end of the 90s, gamers were met with the emergence of Counter-Strike, a mod for Valve's Half-Life. A polar opposite to the over-the-top and futuristic Quake and Unreal, Counter-Strike pitted teams of terrorists and counter-terrorists against each other in objective-based game modes, something rare for its time. Counter-Strike was revolutionary for multiplayer first-person shooters, with the game opening the gate to more grounded and military-realistic games. With technology progressing and the rise in 3D rendered games, the emphasis on shooting enemies for the sake of it began to diminish, and games soon started developing narratives that played out through the game. The early to mid-90s saw shooters that had little narrative to the game and just featured the player completing minor objectives such as killing every enemy or reaching the end of a level. In 1998 came Half-Life, a revolutionary game by Valve. With the narrative written by a novelist, the game sees the player control the mute protagonist, Gordon Freeman. The game was unique at the time as the majority of the game is experienced in real time from the character's perspective, and didn't feature level breaks nor cutscenes. Instead, the player makes his way through a seamless game world, with the narrative told through an in-game dialogue and scripted events. The game was critically acclaimed, and paved the way for more narrative-based shooters, with the game's seamless and vivid design pushing developers to explore more realistic settings, like historical periods such as World War II. 1999 saw the release of DreamWorks Interactive's Medal of Honor, written by legendary film director Steven Spielberg. The game took the player through a campaign set during World War II, being one of the first games to do so, with a variety of games soon following. After wrapping up Saving Private Ryan, Spielberg wanted to develop a shooter that could teach the young audience about World War II, and Medal of Honor was born. Taking control of fictional character Lieutenant Jimmy Patterson, the game took the player through a variety of missions towards the back end of the war. The game was a huge success, with high ratings across the board, and set the bar high for narrative-based shooters. Storytelling became an integral part of shooters as the millennium approached, and long gone were the days of endless violence with no purpose. Games started to put the player within the shoes of fully fledged characters, and began to tell the stories unimaginable in the 1970s and 80s. Storytelling became common within first-person shooters, and the new millennium saw an abundance of story-driven shooters released. The release of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, which at the time was state of the art, saw the releases of generational games Call of Duty and Halo. These two shooters helped define both consoles, with Halo becoming one of Xbox's highest grossing games. Both games featured an immersive and engrossing single player and a very popular multiplayer mode. From the early 2000s onwards, the story has been the same. The advancements in graphical technology, game engines and consoles have enabled developers to push the boundaries and produce outstanding shooters with engaging and enticing narratives. The games that made first-person shooters into what it is today are still popular, and the likes of Wolfenstein and Doom have been remastered and brought back into the modern era. First-person shooters have evolved from mindless killing to film-like storytelling through the eyes of characters you can relate to and bond with. It's been a long journey, and it all started by a wandering amaze.